Hi, everybody. I think we're ready to go. I'm Rick Newman with Yahoo Finance. We're here to talk about the housing recovery, but I think you could almost title this panel, Is This the Next Housing Bust? I'm going to just tick off a couple of things that have been in the news lately. Existing home sales, the latest numbers, down about 8% year over year. New home sales down about 14%. Wall Street Journal just had a story saying mortgage lending has hit a 14-year low. And this is from the New York Times within the last week, I think. The headline is, Why the Housing Market is Still Stalling the Economy, which is something, if you've been coming to these conferences, you've been hearing about for about the last 8, almost feels like 10 years. So we're going to try to get to the bottom of what's going on here with these terrific panelists. You've got the full bios in the book, as you know. I will give you brief introductions here, and then we'll get started. To my left, Steve Brown. He's president of the National Association of Realtors in D.C. Next to him, Jeffrey Gundlach is the CEO of Double Line Capital, which does a lot of trading in mortgage-related securities. Stan Humphries is chief economist of Zillow, which a lot of you will be familiar with if you've bought or sold a house. Jed Kolko is next to him, chief economist at Trulia, another great online resource. And Larry Mizell is our token builder. He's going to give us the view from the ground. So we're going to start with Stan Humphries. Stan, just give us an overview of where the housing market stands. Obviously, we had several terrible years. There has been some sort of recovery. How much of a recovery do we have?
Yeah, so thanks so much, Rick. So of course, the Case-Shiller numbers are out today. Home values still up about 13% from where they were last year. A little bit of slowing evident in those numbers. If we could bring up slide 35. If you exclude foreclosure discounts and look at what's happening to home values and across the entire country, so a much larger footprint than Case-Shiller alone, we see that home values are about 6% from where they were last year. So that's exclusive of the foreclosure discount that's in the Case-Shiller index. And then the green line here is the monthly change in home values, and you can see a real slowdown that's much more evident in our index than in the Case-Shiller index, where basically, and also this data goes through March. The Case-Shiller numbers that came out this morning were through February. So right now, home values are increasing about 0.2% a month, which is about only 1/4 of the pace they were increasing at earlier this summer. So a real slowdown since summertime in terms of home value appreciation.
Stan, I'll just ask you this. So that means that within a few months, we are going to see that the year-over-year numbers are no longer going to be double digits, right?
That's correct. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're seeing remarkable slowing, and this is even more pronounced in some of your first markets to recover. So if you look at Phoenix is actually showing monthly depreciation right now. California markets are also showing positive appreciation, but they're slowing quite rapidly. And really, that the timing of that is really tightly coupled to the 100 basis point increase in mortgage rates that occurred last May and July. I'm sorry, May and June. So affordability really did start to slow the pace of home value increases. I'll just quickly kind of touch on kind of current challenges. Slide 42. Broadly speaking, if you look at affordability of U.S. homes right now, affordability nationally is really quite good, with people spending less of their incomes to buy a home, the median priced home, than they ever have historically. That's not as true, though, in some markets. If you look at some of the California markets particularly, so here you're looking at percentage of income spent to purchase the median priced home, and the tallest bars are the ones that are having affordability issues, and those 4 highest bars are LA, San Diego, San Jose, and San Francisco. Right now in San Jose, historically, people spend about 1/3 of their incomes on a mortgage on a median priced home, and now they're spending closer to 40%, and when rates go back to 6% in a few years, they'll be spending almost half their incomes on a mortgage, which is definitely unsustainable. The other things, kind of in terms of current challenges, household formations are quite sluggish. The new numbers on household formation rates that were out today as well show that we're forming households. We had really good momentum in 2012 of getting household formation rates, which had really taken a plunge during the housing recession, back up to normal. But we actually started to reverse course in 2013 and 2014, where household formation rates in the first quarter of this year were actually about half the pace we were seeing in the same time in 2012, and about 1/3 of the pace we usually see in household formation rates. So we're having a real difficulty creating, creating households right now. A key reason for that is slide 38. The kids are staying at home with us. So if you look at kind of the home ownership rate and the percentage of people under 34 living at home with their parents, rarely in economics do we find something that is tightly as inversely correlated as this chart, where clearly home ownership rate among that cohort has gone down exactly as they're living with their parents. So that's a key reason that's kind of sapping household formation rates. We generally are finding that home ownership aspirations are pretty high, but when renters then go to buy a home, they're finding all sorts of challenges, from tight lending standards to the fact that rents themselves are very high by historical standards, so it's hard for renters to save for down payments to buy a home, and then student debt is also very high. And then just in closing, kind of future prospects, if you look at over the past year and home prices rose about 6%, we're expecting next year about half that pace, so about a little over 3% growth in home prices. We're expecting flat home sales in 2014 relative to 2013, and we're actually concerned that in the out years, home sales are even further challenged, we think, because of the fact that for the past 30 years, we've been in an environment in which mortgage rates have been uniformly falling since the late 70s. We have reached the bottom of that last year at 3.5% on a 30-year fixed rate mortgage. Mortgage rates are going to be going up, and housing turnover tends to go down dramatically when 3 years from now, when people are looking at a 6% mortgage rate and they are in a 3.5 right now in the current house, fewer of them are going to decide to or even be able to move up because they're going to be locked into that mortgage. Okay. Generally, we're pretty bullish on on housing demand, but we think a lot of that housing demand is going to percolate into the rental side and multifamily.
Jeffrey Gundlach, is this a robust housing recovery or not?
It doesn't seem to be. I mean, let's take a look at slide number 57. You hear a lot of talk about how things have improved, and it's true that they have off of the declining world that we were in, but if you look at new home sales, they're not making any progress at all. They're at exactly the same level that they were in 2009, and probably the biggest concern is slide 46, which what's really missing from this picture is first-time buyers. As we just heard a little bit about, you see I have it as slide 46, but it's first-time buyers are not showing up, and one of the reasons for that is household formation, which was just mentioned, but also that was just alluded to, slide 53, which shows that there has been no progress in median incomes, but yet rents have been on the rise. And so when you think about income that is stagnant and renting that is costing more and more, how is a new home buyer supposed to come up with a down payment? And the outlook for that isn't particularly good, because if there's a slide that shows the predictive value of the Case-Shiller single-family home price data, and it compares on the screen right now, I think. No, it doesn't. I don't have the number, I'm sorry, but basically there's a very good lead between the Case-Shiller home price data as a predictive indicator of rent in the future, and as Case-Shiller has gone up, it means rent is going to go higher yet. And so you have to ask yourself, where exactly are these down payments going to come from? One of the things that's been positive in the housing market, obviously, from a certain point of view, is higher prices. But higher prices, reducing negative equity, is incrementally good for the economy and for psychology. But what you need for a trade-up market to really gain traction is you need there to be positive equity. And so you have this kind of a conundrum right now where you need higher home prices to bring back the trade-up buyer, and yet higher home prices deteriorate home affordability even further. There's that predictive chart. Thank you for bringing it up. One of the things that I think has been really misunderstood in the analysis of single-family housing is the affordability equation. There's been so many changes in terms of housing finance that you can't just compare median home prices to median income and draw conclusions about affordability. If you do that, affordability looks vastly better today than it did in 2006. But in 2006, the 30-year conventional mortgage was the exception and not the rule. And it's a 30-year amortizing mortgage that affordability analysis relies upon. You'll remember that in 2006, the world was replete with interest-only loans and option pay loans and things like this that greatly reduce the cost of a home payment with that type of financing versus a 30-year amortizing. These days, 30-year amortizing is more the norm, and affordability in many ways of analysis isn't much better today in various locations than it was in 2005, 2006 time period. And then finally, I think the further challenge is we think we know that GSE reform could be coming. somewhere down the line. And we know one thing, it cannot do anything other than raise relative mortgage rates. So even if we
FDIC is Fannie and Freddie.
Fannie and Freddie. So if you have stable Treasury rates, which some people don't believe in, but if you have even stable Treasury rates, you are likely to have higher mortgage rates as you go through from a public financing scheme into one that has at least some component of private. We did see, indeed, home sales respond very negatively to the rate rise of last summer. A lot of people are confounded by that. They think rates are really low still, and they're supposed to be a driver, but it's really the delta that matters. Comparing today's mortgage rates to 20 years ago is irrelevant. The home buyer that sees rates substantially higher and has seen home affordability using a 30-year amortizer drop by 29% nationwide since a year ago, 29%, given the combination of higher prices and higher mortgage rates. That is why housing is slowing. So we have short-term headwinds, and we have long-term demographic headwinds, I think, as well, which we can get into later, perhaps.
So Larry Mizell, as a builder, what are you seeing in terms of these first-time buyers who should be coming to you to buy a house, but they're living with their parents instead? Are you finding people can't come up with a down payment? All these things, is this playing out on the ground?
It's kind of challenging, but those of you that know the home building industry for 40, 50 years, I had an old saying, it used to be, real estate's always bad except for short periods of time that it's good. So we go through these cycles every decade or so, and this is a great time historically for someone to buy a home at very cheap rates. And the replacement cost, which usually doesn't matter in real estate because we're always seem to be able to replace the product, continues to have a challenge because we're really at a low base rate, and with sales around new home sales around 400,000, you really are at the bottom of a cycle. We used to talk about real estate cycles. Then we talked about the season during the cycle. Then we have a new term in the last 18 months. It's called volatility. Those of you that are in the securities world, you know what volatility is. And now we have a new question, is are we in a secular change of what the new normal is going to be? And if we accept today's levels as a baseline, and I believe today we're at a baseline, as the general economy continues to improve, even if it's slowly, as we see 300,000 homes a year being taken out of the market because of age, you're seeing a very, very material pent-up demand for housing. And what is a better time to buy than when you're completely out of favor? You know, there's some young man from Omaha that used to talk a little bit about when to buy and when to sell. And you're at a unique period. Everything that these gentlemen have pointed out on their charts are accurate. We're living through a very nuanced period of time, but the information that you've seen is really good. But what it really does is reinforce a base. And I think the worst place you could be is not in the market at this time, because you have an industry that has gone from, I don't know, tens of thousands of persons. At one time it was 4% of the GDP, new homes. It's down below maybe 2%. And this is a big factor. And Rick, as we move through this period of time, whether it takes us another year or 2 or 3, you're at a cyclical low for the housing industry. And yes, it hit 285,000 for one period of time here a year or so ago. But right now we're forming a new base, and I think your comments and the comments of the gentleman here really reinforce the opportunity for new home sales. And we're very optimistic about, on a long-term basis, about the industry.
Larry, since you sort of characterize yourself as the wise old man of this industry, let me just ask you, what you see now, does this look similar to anything else you've seen in the last 40 years? I mean, do you say, oh, this is similar to the early 80s, or is it totally different from other difficult periods?
Well, Rick, I've been through 4 cycles. The first rule of success is don't go broke. So if you don't violate the first rule, you have a chance to be on the next cycle. And so if you focus on it, what is it on this cycle that's unique? Nothing much. It lasted from, it peaked in about 05, 06. You can kind of see where it peaked, and this is inverse. That's where the sales really peaked in 05, 06. And what you had then was a period of uniqueness in time where the gross sales had unlimited pricing power, and consequently the affordability continued to shrink. And one thing that hasn't been mentioned, because we don't talk about it anymore, is called subprime lending. And you're talking about Freddie and Fannie and the prospective restructuring of them. But you also had in that 05, 06 period the most unique, aggressive mortgage financing for anyone, whatever their circumstances are. And now you have to really have good credit. You have to have a down payment. You have to have a job. And you have to have a full set of documents. I don't think that's unreasonable.
What is this nation coming to? Jed, so Larry says it's that you need to be in this market. Why are more people not getting in this market? Is it just they don't have the money, or more factors?
Are you speaking of the consumer, or are you speaking of the builder? I think
I'm asking Jed to kind of pick up.
Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize.
I was enjoying the wisdom of experience, and instead of that, in the absence of wisdom, we'll have a little data.
That's always good.
Always an okay substitute. I think what we're seeing is that the recovery is really uneven. And if you're looking for the housing recovery in first-time home buyers, you're not seeing it. And you're not going to see it probably for at least 2 or 3 years. I think what's happened is that we've moved from a phase in the housing recovery that started about 2 years ago and is ending just about now. That was an investor and bargain hunter phase. Prices were incredibly low, combined with low mortgage rates. We saw a lot of investors purchasing homes in part to rent them out. That gave a big boost to home prices. It also gave a big boost to sales, particularly existing home sales. We're seeing both those things slow down now as the investor and bargain phase of the housing recovery is fading. The next phase that is underway is the renter phase. And we see this mostly with young adults. Young adults have been incredibly important for the housing recovery, particularly around demand. And if we could pull up slide 26, it'll show you the employment rate among 25 to 34-year-olds. Now, this is the prime age group for people moving out of their parents' basements into their own household, either as a renter or as a buyer. This is the percent of 25 to 34-year-olds that have a job. It was about 78 to 80% before the bubble burst, plummeted to about 74. It's now not even halfway back up to normal. Still a long way to go for young people getting back to work. But it is rising, and because of that, we're starting to see stronger housing demand, but it's on the rental side, because those young people are moving out of their parents' basements first into rentals. And if we look at the effect of that, which is on slide 27, it's not construction of single-family homes, it's not new home sales, it's apartment construction. What the orange line is showing you is that in 2013, apartment construction in the US hit a 15-year high, even though the blue line, which is single-family home construction, was only a little bit up from the bottom. So if we're looking at first-time home buyers, if we're looking at single-family construction, that's not where we're seeing the housing recovery right now. We didn't see it in the first phase, investor-driven. We're not seeing it in the current phase, it's renter-driven. What we are seeing is this huge unevenness. And the one other thing I want to mention is that the unevenness is also local. We've been talking so far about a national housing market and national trends, but each local market is having its own separate recovery. And if we could flip to slide 23, what I want to point out is that there are some markets that are having huge price rebounds, and those have really been the investor-driven markets, places that were hard hit during the bust, places like Las Vegas, Oakland, the Inland Empire, Los Angeles, Atlanta, that have recently seen some of the big price increases, biggest price rebounds in the country. None of those markets with the biggest price rebounds are the markets that have seen the biggest construction boom in the last year. Those are on the right. Those are places where there's strong demand for apartment rentals from young people, strong job growth, household formation. That's where we're seeing fundamentals driving a very different kind of local recovery. Big cities like San Francisco, New York, and Boston, energy-driven, energy sector-driven markets like Houston, Oklahoma City, other parts of the more expensive coasts as well. The last thing I want to mention is this focus on renters and young people suggests that, at least in the short run, what's holding us back is demand. And the most important thing, if you wanted to help the housing market right now, the most important thing you could do would be to hire an unemployed 26-year-old, particularly if they're still living with their parents, because that will give them a chance to get their own rental and eventually to buy.
But they have no relevant skills, so what are they going to do?
So
Sorry, I heard that in another panel.
It may take a while to find that right 26-year-old, but it's the way to help the housing market. Long term, I think the biggest issue is supply, particularly in urban areas. So the last slide I just want to look at is slide 24. And what slide 24 is showing us is long term, the affordability crisis that we have in many parts of the country are primarily about supply. So if we look at a set of markets that have a lot of tech in the industry, so a set of markets that are somewhat similar in their economic base, San Francisco, Seattle, the DC area, Austin, Raleigh, look at where median home prices are right now and compare that to construction over the past 25 years. There is no metro that is affordable that doesn't build. Every affordable metro either builds or is economically depressed and not on this chart. So you've got on one hand San Francisco, other very expensive markets that have strong demand, but build almost no housing, typically. The more affordable markets, similar economic base, places like Austin and Raleigh, build a huge amount of housing.
What's the cause and effect there?
So the reason these supply-constrained places have two things going for them typically. These are all places, first of all, with strong demand.
Yeah.
Austin, San Francisco, DC, Seattle, these are all places with strong long-term demand. But what separates someplace like San Francisco or New York or Boston from someplace like Austin and Raleigh is that it's harder to build. And it's harder to build for two reasons. Some of it is God made it that way. So San Francisco is a peninsula with an ocean on one side, a bay on the other, mountains nearby. Think about New York. Manhattan's an island. Miami is basically a strip of land sandwiched between the ocean and the Everglades. There's not a lot of flat land in any of those places to build on. That is going to make tight supply, and they're good natural locations, which makes for strong demand. But on top of that, these are places where regulations make it much more expensive to build than in other parts of the country. And when we think about one of the biggest issues facing us long-term in terms of housing, this is not a short-term problem. This is a long-term problem about affordability in the most expensive markets and making sure that these incredibly productive and desirable places are places that our children, people from other countries, people from other parts of the US can come live in. A long-term focus needs to be making it easier to build in some of these expensive markets. Now, unless we sort of level the mountains and fill in the ocean, It's not going to come from changing the topography or geography. It's got to come from looking at local building regulations, local zoning. That is one of the, again, long-term factors that keep some of these most expensive markets unaffordable.
Okay. Steve Brown, tell us, what can you add sort of market intelligence from realtors? We've got pretty good sweep of the broad trends. Right. Are realtors seeing a market that's healing or a market that's worsening?
Thanks, Rick. Certainly the market is healing. I'd reference the slide 32. This shows distress sales are trending downward. Now just look back at 2009. Look at the number of foreclosure and short sales. Look where we are today. So the trend is clearly in the right direction. This is good news. Slide 29. Investor sales are headed downward. We think that's a good thing in the marketplace. Obviously, investors came in, bought properties that were, let's see, first time, sorry about that. Is that the right? No. Investors' share may be headed down. Anyway, investor purchases in the marketplace, there we go, are clearly on the downswing based upon two things, price increases and a tight inventory in the market. Slide 34, please. Rising home prices have also decreased the number of properties with negative equity. This is good. This is a good trend. Slide 29. First-time home buyers. We've talked a lot about first-time home buyers. We would like to see first-time home buyers around 40 to 45% of the market. That's what we have been used to prior to the recession. You can see where it slipped down to around 30% of the market. Now, notably, there is a uptick this year in first-time home buyer sales. But as the panelists have all indicated, first-time home buyers are suffering from the ability to put together a down payment. Number two, student debt is considered very strongly now in their ability to qualify for financing. They also carry other debt, naturally. They're young. They carry credit card debt. They carry a car loan debt normally. All of these things are preventing the first-time home buyer to really entering into the market because the weakness, if you will, in the job market to be able to afford that ability to handle the debt and purchase a property. Slide 28, please. This, though, is, I think, Rick, the slide that I would like to most emphasize. And this is a consumer confidence. The realtors in the country, there are about 2 million licensees, real estate licensees in the U.S. The realtors represent about 1 million of those licensees. Of the real estate transactions done in the country, about 90% of all real estate transactions are done by realtors. So this is a confidence survey that's done every 6 months by NAR.
That's a survey of realtors?
Of realtors. And their trending has been very accurate. It's 6 months out, and if you notice the increase in confidence, if you will, in the marketplace, so if you go back 6 months, you're in a down period, but if you look forward 6 months, you can see the trend is upward. There is a definite level of confidence in the marketplace. Also, this will go in hand with the fact that in March we did see a 3.4% rise in pending sales. That actually broke a 9-month record of decline in pending sales. The recovery, if you look at it as short term, is it where we want it to be? No. We look at probably the total number of units sold this year will stay very closely to what was sold last year, around that 5 million, 5.1 million mark. We also potentially project a very minor decline of maybe 1%. But overall, we feel as though the market is stable. Prices are stable. In some markets, of course, as prices are escalating. If you ask a realtor, do we want to see a return of double-digit appreciation, most realtors would say, we don't want to see that. It becomes uncontrollable and it becomes unaffordable in the marketplace, and it leads people into buying a property, buying a home for the wrong reason, and that's a short-term gain rather than a long-term investment.
I'm going to conduct my own confidence survey. I want to ask the panelists, if you're optimistic about the housing market, raise your hand. And if you're not sure, you're not optimistic.
Overall housing market, like rental and...
Overall, yeah. Are you optimistic?
Overall?
4 out of 5 in general? Okay. A couple of you mentioned investors' role in the market. Now, around this time last year, it looked like the market was recovering for real, and we knew there was some investor activity. It takes time to figure out how much it is. Now, the storyline seems to be that most of the gain in 2013 was driven by investors, not by ordinary families buying homes, or at least not by a significant increase. Can somebody, whoever wants to do it, just summarize what is the role of investors and what's going on there? Go ahead,
Sure.
Jay.
So I think there are two things to keep in mind when we talk about investors. Investors came in and bought lots of vacant homes and rented them out at a time when there were a lot of vacant homes, a lot of homes with no people in them, and people who needed homes. There was difficulty getting a mortgage. We're in the middle of a recession. It's essentially what the government wanted to do in the RU at a rental program, but investors ended up doing that. And if it weren't for the investor buying, we would have had a lot of people who were looking for a place to rent, a single-family home, perhaps in the neighborhood where they lost their own home, and a lot more vacant homes. Now, it pushed up prices. It hurt affordability for people who ended up not being able to buy a house for themselves. Now, some people have wondered, has the fact that a lot of the price increases that we've seen, because they've been investor-driven, are they therefore not real? So they are not real only in the sense that we are now downshifting to rely more on job and income growth, and household formation, employment among young people isn't enough to sustain the demand that we saw from investors. But the price increases that we saw from investors were certainly real. And for someone who had been underwater and was then able to sell their home because there was demand from investors, that's a very real effect. And even people who weren't looking to sell their home but saw prices rising and decided that they actually did have some skin in the game, that they would be back above water someday, it no longer seemed as appealing to fall behind on their payments. So even if the sales volumes won't continue because investor purchasing has declined, a lot of the effects that we've seen, both in making it possible for people who needed rental homes to find them, and for people to see some needed appreciation in their home values, those effects are very real.
So has this played out? Are we back to something you might call a normal rate of investor activity here, or is it still, is this still having an outsized effect in the market?
I think it's very market to market. And when we looked at that list of metros, if we want to just briefly put that back up against slide 23, the metros that have seen the biggest price increases year over year, a lot of that has been investors and others looking for bargains. And when we talk about investors, that's a broad range of buyers, big institutional investors, small mom and pops, as well as people looking for bargains for themselves. They're still influencing, adding to those price increases there. There were other markets where investors were a small part of the story. Again, those markets on the right-hand side, much more organic demand from household formation, income, and job growth.
Investors are still a pretty big part of the market. I mean, they're not in Phoenix and Riverside and Vegas anymore. They're more in the Midwest and markets that still have a lot of foreclosures. And because that creates demand for rentals when you're foreclosing on a homeowner, and it creates the cheap inventory they need to buy. So essentially, the investors. I mean, I think investors have been fantastic. I mean, they've been essential to the recovery because they were buying homes in 2009, 2010 when no one wanted to touch a home. Yep. And they bought them, and they had a long horizon, and they needed to. We had a home ownership rate of we had a housing stock that was oriented towards a 70% home ownership rate, and we're headed towards a 63% home ownership rate. We need someone to buy homes that used to be owner occupied and convert them over into rentals, and they were doing that. Yep. And that's really important.
Right.
Right, and the investor in the marketplace stabilized these communities where there was a heavy volume of foreclosed properties. So that became a very important part of the market, and that's not to be, it's not to criticize at all the investor and their role at that time in the marketplace. It was a very good role and needed in communities where there were multiple homes in the area that were deteriorating. And these investors, in most cases, came in and improved the properties, rented them, or resold them.
And I'm not implying to criticize these investors. I think the question I'm asking is whether we misunderstood what was going on last year. We called it a recovery as if ordinary buyers were recovering, and we just called it wrong.
I think it's also a little bit of a overstatement to describe it as a fully an investor-led recovery. That certainly investors were an important part of that recovery, but I mean, you look at the home ownership rate, yes, it's down from, say, a long-term average of 43% down to low 30s. But I mean, I would say that the key to price appreciation in the period right after the trough in late 2011 was really a combination of a 10-year reset in prices, a mortgage rate on 30-year fixed, which was half of what it normally is, and extraordinarily high levels of negative equity, which reduced inventory. So, the first two led to a lot of demand, more home buyers chasing, and the last one, negative equity, reduced inventory. So more buyers chasing fewer sellers leads to price spikes. And that's what really led to those price gains, not just investors bidding up prices.
Well, Jeffrey, if all of these optimists are wrong, what is the sort of downside scenario here? What might we not be foreseeing?
Well, first of all, I want to point out that I don't think you can say low interest rates had a lot to do with the increase in home values at the moderate to low end. I think it had a lot to do with the high end, zero interest rate policy and cash buying therefore, and also low interest rates. But if you take a look at slide 60, this is what's going on with mortgage applications for purchases. And you can see that there's absolutely no uptick at all. So it is not true that home purchases have somehow been spurred by low interest rates. It may have stopped it from going lower in terms of borrowing, but it hasn't happened. Now, one thing that has clearly happened with investment buying is slide 52, which shows just how many homes have gone from being owned to being rentals. And the 09 period there, 07, 09 is part of this, but then you see 09 to 11, you see quite a few homes that have gone to rental status, which isn't an end game. This is kind of a way station from being once owned by somebody to then in foreclosure to now owned by somebody who has an investment fund that probably has a certain investment life and then wants to dispose of these properties. So this is potential supply that overhangs the market. And one thing that is also happening in the data that's interesting to look at is slide 47, where you see very different trends in the sales of homes based upon the value of the home. You can see on the left-hand panel that the year-over-year sales of high-priced homes are very substantial. And this has to do with, it's a geographically diverse real estate market, but it also has a lot to do with investor buying and zero interest rate policy, where you see there's absolutely nothing going on in the median to lower price home area. I think that the biggest pending risk longer term for the housing market is demographics. I think that if you look at what's going to happen to the demographics in the developed world over the next 10 years, and I would really encourage everybody to look into this, there is a radical shift happening in demographics of the developed world. The United States is actually better off than most countries, but we have talked a little bit about first-time home buyers being absent, but what about, shall I call them, first-time home sellers, which is potentially the baby boomers. Baby boomers are notoriously high risk in their lifestyle choices, and one of the things that they've done is accumulated very low savings for retirement. So what does a baby boomer really have with their zero retirement savings, but they have a house that maybe they bought 15 years ago? They've got an asset that they can sell and then turn themselves into a renter and monetize that capital gain, and that is additional supply. So I think the demographic aspect of the aging of the baby boomers is important, particularly when you juxtapose it against what we've talked about with the lack of employment opportunity and income growth at the lower end, and something that's a little squishy, which is preferences. There's a lot of been talked about, a hot topic these days is that the millennials don't mind renting, they don't mind living in micro apartments, they don't mind staying in micro hotels. I think very strongly that one of the better investment opportunities in the world of real estate is catering to these preference shifts towards micro living. In fact, the regulations, the zoning, is one of the barriers to these sort of micro apartment kind of worlds because of anti-tenement laws basically have been in place for a long time. But when the local politicians begin to realize that turning a 200-unit building into a 400-unit building will increase the tax base, and that everybody seems to be in favor of it, I see that there will be a shift towards greater acceptance of this type of movement. I don't want to go on too much of a soapbox on this, but I think this has a lot to do with how society has changed from when most of us were kids and you went out playing and the deal was be home by 11 o'clock and everything's good and safe, but now with the internet world of this viral repetition of bad behavior in society, I don't think bad behavior's changed that much. Awareness has. So all of a sudden, kids are not allowed to play outside. They're all about connectivity through social media. No wonder they want not to sit in their room and sit around on their iPhone. They want to sit in the lobby with other of their friends, so at least they can have some level of connectivity from a physical standpoint. I think all of these things argue against this idea that we're going to go back to 1995 in terms of the housing market. I would be so bold as to say in the next generation we will never see another year of 1.5 million new home starts.
You know, anecdotally, since I work at Yahoo, we run these stories every now and then about tiny homes. These are people, usually they'll build these themselves. It's like a 300 square foot home. And you understand, you learn all these clever little things they do to manage to live in there. The traffic we get on these stories is off the charts, so we keep doing them. I don't know how much of a trend this is, but I'm going to ask Larry. Larry, are you planning to build any 300 square foot homes? Are you opening a tiny home division?
First of all, I think the comment on inner city living with smaller units is something that we think is imminent. I don't know if we can get down to 300 square feet, and most places require parking, so that pretty well takes care of the value, the cost of the land vis-a-vis the unit. But we do see that people would like to stay closer into the city, and smaller units are necessary. But the other thing that we're doing that I think is really cool is, I think they call it the multi-generational home. That may not be exactly perfect, but what it really is it's a single-family detached home that has within it, with an outside entrance, and maybe not a connection, another little apartment, you know, in about that 300 square foot range. To take a 2,500 square foot home, carve out 300 feet, give it its own front door, and a full unit. And that's for the kids, the grandparents, someone's office. But you see in residential areas that this is really pretty slick.
Well, you've just cut the demand for housing by 50%.
Well,
that's the kids living at home. I mean, that's where they're living.
Or nursing homes
or the baby boomer that's
and
moving in with the kids.
Right.
Well, the kids are coming back home. You can't get rid of them. So they either don't leave home or they come back to the home.
Stop feeding them. They leave then.
Yeah, if you quit funding, it would work. The other thing is...
That's like the old mother-in-law suite, except that one was way in the backyard, not attached, right?
This is really slick. I mean, they have, where you have your front door, they have to the side a very nice entrance, a fully self-contained home. And as I said, it may or may not connect inside. Most people prefer that it doesn't. And the kids, the teenagers, this to them is as close to heaven they're going to get. You know, they get room and board, and they get their laundry done, and mom doesn't know and dad doesn't know if they come or go, except for the fact of the camera that's out there that watches them.
Larry, I'm glad you're here. This chart here reminds me of something I've been wondering about, and I'm going to ask you about it. So I'm looking at that chart that shows the average size of a new single-family home. Recently, this jumped. I don't know if that comes from the NAHB, but the National Association of Home Builders does track this, and their data shows that single-family homes are now bigger than they've ever been after that big drop there. What is going on that is driving new homes to those sizes? Is it just upper-income buyers? Is it that simple, or is there more to it?
No, I think if your land component goes up, what you really end up attempting to do is to put a larger home on a smaller lot. And in the world we live in, we do what you might call a 9-foot fully finished basement with big window wells where you don't see that you're in a basement like an old basement where, you know, it was 7 foot and then, you know, something beam came across, but you have a 9-foot basement and it's fully finished. By the way, besides, you know, the granny unit that you have there, you can also take the basement and put in a full kitchen and a full bathroom. So now you've parked 2 kids, one over here, one down here, and the square footage, hard cost per square foot for adding 200 square feet or 300 is really not very expensive. It's the least expensive part of the home. The land, the plumbing, the basic elements of a home, but adding the additional square footage is really creates a compelling value, which helps sell a home, because today you do have to deliver value, and that's part of the marketing of what's happening.
Yeah, okay.
It's also important, I think probably that trend exaggerates it a little bit, because there has been a skew. Builders are generally building more upmarket now than they have in recent years past. So more expensive homes within their market. So those more expensive homes for a wealthier demographic tend to be larger homes as well. So there's a little bit of a mix shift going on in that curve.
We will take some questions in a, yeah, let me just, we will take some questions in a moment. If anybody wants to think up your question, we're going to give time to put some microphones around. I'm going to ask 1 or 2 more, but you go ahead, Jed.
Yeah, so just a somewhat different view on changing preferences over the long term. And again, this is different from demographics. There are certainly demographic shifts going on. People are waiting longer to get married. Seniors are, on average, older as we're seeing the age distribution shift. But I'd be very cautious to call big changes in preferences in how people want to live or where they want to live. There's been such a dramatic cycle in the housing market. The boom, we saw a lot of overbuilding of single-family homes. We saw a shift away from cities towards suburbs and exurban areas. More recently, we've seen this construction in cities, a lot of demand for urban living. I think most of this is cyclical. And I think it's very hard to see what might be happening in terms of preferences changing long term until this cycle fully settles out. And I think these trends probably should be presumed cyclical until proven structural rather than the other way around, because we are at a point right now in the cycle when young people are moving out of their parents' homes, are looking for a place to rent. We're at a moment when there is strong demand for rentals and strong demand for living in cities. But when we look at where people are actually moving, almost twice as many people still move from city to suburb as from suburb to city. When we do surveys, people say they want walkability, they want to be able to have a short commute to work, and then when we see where they're looking for homes on Trulia's site, we see that people are far more likely to be looking from city to suburb than from suburb to city. So I think there are some very deep preferences that change slowly, and it's hard to see given the sharp cycle that we've had.
I'll just open this to all 5 of you. Whoever wants to answer briefly, please. Does anybody want to offer an opinion about whether more renters and fewer owners is a good thing or a bad thing? The homeownership rate peaked at about 69%, I think. It's down around, it's below, it's about 64, I think. The latest number just came out today. That's about where the historical average is, I think. So does this feel kind of right, or?
Well, I guess, I mean, if you look so if you look historically, I mean, we're still slightly above average. I mean, if you think 64% is the long-term average, and the numbers that we're out today is high 60, well, seasonally adjusted about 65%. But remember, that also includes a number of people who are delinquent and foreclosed on their homes who are actually still living in their house.
Yep.
So that number is closer to probably really being 63%, because a lot of those people are not going to end up being in their homes in another year. But if you look at internationally, that's still a very high homeownership rate as well. And there's actually, I think Americans have this concept of more homeownership is always better, but if you actually look at the countries that have really high homeownership rates, they tend to be the less stable societies out there. I mean, Greece and Romania have very high homeownership rates because Greece and Romania, owning your little piece of land is pretty important. Whereas those that have the lowest homeownership rates tend to be very stable societies. Think Germany or Switzerland. So I think generally, there's a lot of this kind of thought about America's becoming a renter nation just because we're down from 70%. But really, you really have to view that 70% that we got to back in 2004, 2005 as the historical anomaly, and we're just getting back to normal. And we'll probably overshoot a little bit, but that's not a bad thing. And it's still predominantly we're a nation of homeowners.
Larry, you happy about a nation of renters?
I think it's perfect because they're all going to buy a home every time they raise their rent. They'll come out and look for a new home. Because remember, the business model of all the homes that were bought are to raise the rent. In fact, you can look in the public documents every 90 days. They publish how much they were able, 0.3% per quarter or whatever it is, trying to get 3 or 4% pricing power. So that person that's renting, he's reminded every chance that lease comes up why he wants to own a home, because it's the business objective of the owner of these homes is to raise the income so they can ultimately do a transaction to sell it. So these are all prospective buyers, and as their credit improves, because we have a great system in this country. You can go bankrupt, you can get foreclosed, you can do everything. But after 3 years, we start you all over again. So these people, this is really a good service to the housing industry. And the people that bought these homes for rentals, I think are going to do really, really well because their entry point was very timely. And as you commented on secular changes, that was my last statement. Cycles, seasons, volatility, and now secular changes. And that's what makes this industry so exciting.
If we have any questions from the audience, we could take them. It's a little hard for me to see, so shout out a little bit. You need a microphone up in front. Please keep it short, please.
Just a simple question. One of the meetings yesterday, somebody said that the FICO requirements were effectively rationing mortgage credit beyond what judicious underwriting would or wouldn't do. To what degree is that true? And if it is this a permanent thing, or how does that change, and should it change?
So you're talking about credit scores and basically everything's...
Rationing, rates are low, but in
nobody
business,
can get a loan. Yeah,
exactly.
It's not permanent. I mean, again, that's a cyclical thing. So I mean, on the heels of a massive financial recession and housing recession, it's natural to have lending standards go up, and that does throttle the number of people who can access mortgages and therefore home ownership rate. But I think we're already seeing, you've seen a number of large financial institutions start to target lower FICO scores for mortgages. In Zillow's mortgage marketplace, we're seeing actually there's not an uptick in demand for among lower FICO score applicants yet, but there's more supply. Those people who are applying and have FICO scores below 630, traditionally subprime, are actually getting more offers now from lending institutions. And you're definitely seeing LTV scores start to erode, where people, before, you've seen kind of a strict, for conventional mortgages, more of a 20% down payment, 80% LTV. You're seeing that start to erode because, of course, refinances have gone to zero as mortgage rates rise, and banks have to keep their business, and they're getting more creative. And with QM, qualified mortgage legislation, the box that they're in is a 43% debt to income ratio and point and fees caps, but they can get creative around LTV and FICO scores, and you're going to see them get more creative.
There have been a couple of sort of breathless headlines about banks are offering subprime mortgages again, as if, oh my God, here we go, it's another housing bust. Back me up on this. I have said, look, it's a good thing that banks are doing this. I mean, as long as these loans are priced correctly and the risk is understood, subprime is a good thing. Am I right about that?
Yeah, we're nowhere near the credit that we saw in 2005 and 2006. Yeah. I mean, the reason why we should see mortgage credit starting to loosen is, first of all, with the rise in mortgage rates, the rise in interest rates, refinance demand has plummeted. And so some banks are looking instead to the home purchase business to take the place of some of that lost refi demand. The other thing is I'm actually optimistic about the effect of these new qualified mortgage rules that longer term they will increase lending because it's giving banks some of the clarity around their legal risks that they've been asking for.
Okay, any other questions? Got one right here, if we can get a microphone. You're lucky in the front row because I can see you. Go ahead.
Can you comment on the likelihood of the sunset of the GSEs and implications?
So this is Fannie and Freddie reform bills to figure out what to do about them, since they're basically sort of zombie companies right now. Steve, you want to grab that?
I'll take that. So I was in Washington yesterday, and of course, what's on the front plate right now is the bill that's coming out of the Senate Banking Committee, the Johnson-Crapo bill, which really does shut down Freddie and Fannie, but introduces a similar program that does provide a government guarantee, and we feel that that's very important. The problem is that there are so many issues in and around that subject that it's probably doubtful that that bill will pass. It will come out of committee, go to the Senate perhaps. But there are still many provisions there that remain a concern. One, with a upfront guarantee. In other words, taking the taxpayers out of the first line of loss, if you will, on these loans. There's a cost to that. And the concern is how much of a cost will that mean to the mortgager. So that's a concern that is out.
And the cost would push mortgage rates up.
Push the mortgage rates up, and there are all kinds of projections on that, and there's also some solutions to that. There's just no doubt that something will be and has to be done. This is really the last piece the administration identifies as the remaining from the Great Recession that needs to be fixed. Will it have the political ability to go forward within the next year, within this year? I know the administration hopes that it will. There's probably a very short period of time. Consumer groups are concerned about this because it threatens affordability of the mortgages, the cost of mortgages, the rate of mortgages. Other groups are concerned for various reasons. It's also entering into an unknown. So
let me just ask, Steve, just because something has to be done doesn't have anything to do with whether Washington will actually do it. Is it plausible that nothing gets done for a long time and we just limp forward with Fannie and Freddie as it is for 10 years?
Well, I mean, limping forward, Fannie and Freddie are in a cash-making position right now. So the drive to close Freddie and Fannie is clearly gone. I mean,
they're actually helping lower the deficit.
Without question.
Yeah.
Fannie and Freddie, the taxpayer has covered about $188 billion of their loss. And today, they've essentially paid that back to the federal government. So the push to get rid of this liability is simply lost right now because of the fact that they are a money maker. And bear in mind, for decades, these entities operated very successfully and provided that guarantee in the market, provided a flow of capital to the market when the private sector would pull out, and also provided a 30-year fixed rate product.
Steve, I'm going to try to get one more question if it's quick. Anybody? We got one up here unless someone has the. We're done. I'm showing a minute left, but that's okay. All right, sorry. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.